Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and the Harvard Classic Lectures. We are now in lecture 106, Thoreau's Walden, chapter 7, The Bean Field. We'll, of course, meet the capitalist Thoreau, if we can even use that term. Now, our assumptions here are that you've already been following our stuff at learnstrong.net in the Harvard Classics folder, lectures 99 through 105 for sure, although it will help, especially in a conversation like the one we're to have now, if you have some background as well with our comments on Emerson. As well, in the junior folder on learnstrong.net, you'll find as well that I've given a number of comments already about Thoreau and Walden. We're as well assuming that you are appreciative of our 3 levels of reading. At level 1, we answer the question, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, rhetoric. Not what Thoreau says, but how he says it. For example, he will say, as he's talking about seeds, he spends quite a bit of time here in this chapter talking about seeds. He'll talk about the seeds of new man, and of course the symbolism will fall into that 2B category. And finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way, right? That is to say, at 3A, how can I relate to other parts of Walden as well as to other texts that I know? And then finally, how can I relate to myself? The other assumption is that you're conversant with our use of the Big Five. That is to say, what does this text suggest about epistemology, what we can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the study of the individual mind and its motivations, sociology, the analysis of the group, and then finally, theodicy, the question of why is there evil or pain or suffering in this world? All of these will play a role here. Now, as we said, this is the quote-unquote capitalist Thoreau, as it sometimes is referred to, because he's going to talk about his understanding of work. And I like to think that all of Walden is a poem. I call it a prose poem in other lectures. I will here as well. All of Walden, it seems to me, is a poem that emphasizes the notion of walking as living, and in this case, walking as working, right? And again, as we said, we have these pairs, these dualities, this traveling between Scylla and Charybdis. And here we'll see in chapter 7 we have the bean field, and in chapter 8 we'll have the village. And we'll ask about how these two pairs of texts can be read together. Now let's summarize real quickly and then get into the actual text itself. First of all, we're going to have Thoreau at the very beginning describing the experience that he's had of farming while he's lived at Walden, of course. And then we're going to hear him talk about the way that the bean field in some ways represents, right, reality, the forms of different types of physical labor as well as being attuned to nature. He'll write of turning up Indian arrowheads as he will hoe, as he will plant his beans and other crops. Of course, the suggestion here is that his use of this land is cyclical in some interesting ways, right? I mean, there were people on the land before him, there will be people afterwards, and obviously this is all about the history of the relationship to the natural world and obviously the world of culture as well. Now his bean field, of course, is there. I mean, he goes into some pretty intense detail about all of this. You can tell he's really proud of the work that he did here in his bean field, but of course, he's going to very quickly, this won't shock us, he's going to very quickly as well want to talk about his bean field as in some ways a representation, a metaphor, right, of the, what would one say, the field of the inner self that, of course, has to be taken care of just like crops have to be tended, right? He'll comment, for example, on the position of his bean field between the world of nature, we could call it wild, he does, and the world of the village of Concord, that is to say cultivated people. A position, in other words, not really totally unlike the one that he has at Walden Pond itself, right? He'll remember the sights, he'll remember the sounds that are a part of his hoeing. Of course, the noise of the town is also, and the celebrations he'll talk about, and especially the military training. It's compelling that he will talk about hearing the guns go off, for example, during a military training, and he says they sound like pop guns, but you have this very interesting dichotomy about here he is living in the woods, hoeing his bean field, and he hears these celebrations of military parades. Of course, Thoreau, the great pacifist, you can imagine, is going to make some observations about that. He obviously can't be a little, he can't help but be a little bit satirical about the ways in which, all of the military parades will emphasize what he obviously believes to be something other than heroic in some ways, right? He then will talk about how he tended his beans, while some of the other people that could have been considered his contemporaries are away studying art in Boston, he will say, or in Rome, he's engaging in, they're engaging in contemplation and trade in faraway places. But he doesn't want to think that his work is in any way inferior to the work of his colleagues. You kind of get this sense in Walden that Thoreau spent his 2 years there, and then he came back and he published his book, and he wanted to give a legitimacy to the 2 years, like I didn't waste my time, because you kind of get the sense that some of his intellectual equals are probably saying things like, really? Really? I think you probably could have been using your time better. And he wants to make the argument, and we'll see it obviously here. He points out that he really doesn't care very much about beans necessarily, but he's more interested in, obviously, the symbolic nature of these beans. Obviously, he's a writer, so he's going to draw on all of these kinds of... I would say he's a poet more than even a writer, and he's going to draw on these word pictures. He promises in the future that he's not going to sow beans, but the seeds of, quote, sincerity, truth, simplicity, faith, innocence, and the like, end quote. He'll continue with his seed imagery, referring to planting, as we've already said, the seeds of new men. And then he begins to kind of wax about the way in which, and Cato, the great writer, did something similar, recognizing the decline. I mean, this will remind us of Republic 8 and the declension of state, but he'll be sad, he'll lament the decline in farming from the ancient times, especially of the Romans. He points out that agriculture has become something quite different. I mean, we can only imagine what he'd have to say today, right? We live in an agricultural community, we understand this. Now, of course, it's a commercial enterprise. In some ways, the farmer has lost some of that relationship between himself, herself, and nature, right? Finally, he ends by commenting on the true husbandman will never cease to worry about the size of the crop. The true husbandman will no longer worry about the size of the crop or the gain and the amount of emolument that's been made from it. Rather, is going to pay attention to the work that is particular, his in making the land grow, fruitful, and the like. Now, when we turn to the actual text, and as I've said about all of my previous studies of these chapters, I'd love to be able to read it all to you. Let's just at least enjoy the opening lines. He says, "Meanwhile, my beans, the length of whose rows added together was 7 miles already planted, were impatient to be hoed." He personifies everything in nature, and of course here it is. "For the earliest had grown considerably before the latest were in the ground. Indeed, they were not easily to be put off." What was the meaning of this so steady and self-respecting, this small Herculean labor? I know not. Now, the idea of him mentioning Hercules, we've said already that I think Thoreau really does think of himself as as an Achillean figure. We've mentioned his use of the Iliad and the like. Now it's Hercules, right? He says, "I came to love my rows, my beans, though so many more than I wanted. They attached me to the earth." And any of us that garden understand exactly what it is that he's saying. "And so I got strength like Antaeus. But why should I raise them?" Obviously the question. Only heaven knows. And he'll comment on farmers that drive by and look over and go, "Beans? Seriously, beans? Why not corn? Why not other kind of crops or whatever?" This was my curious label all summer, and I love the word curious because it really does capture Thoreau. "To make this portion of the earth's surface, which had yielded only cinnaphole and blackberries and John's wort and the like, before sweet wild fruits and pleasant flowers, produce instead this pulse," and I love that he uses the word pulse. "What shall I learn of beans or beans of me? I cherish them, I hoe them, early and late, I have an eye to them, and this is my day's work. It's a fine broad leaf to look on. My auxiliaries are the dews and the rains, which draw this dry soil, and what fertility is in the soil itself, which for the most part is lean and effete. My enemies are worms." He speaks in this kind of marshalling language. Remember he said in chapter 2, I want to drive life into a corner. We got something similar here. My enemies, and we'll hear more about this right as we get into this thing about military parades, my enemies are worms, cool days, and most of all woodchucks. He'll talk a lot about how the woodchucks like to eat in his beans. The last have nibbled for me a quarter of an hour clean. But what right had I to oust John's wort and the rest and break up their ancient herb garden? Soon, however, the remaining beans will be too tough for them and go forward to meet new foes. One of the things that Thoreau is constantly emphasizing in the poem Walden is the growing, the evolving, the fact that we move from life to death to life again. And he'll play that game. He says a couple of lines later, I planted about 2.5 acres of upland. And as it was only about 15 years since the land was cleared, I myself had got out 2 or 3 cords of stumps, I did not give it any manure. But in the course of the summer, it appeared by the arrowheads, which I turned up in hoeing, that an extinct nation had anciently dwelt here and planted corn and beans ere white men came to clear the land. And so, to some extent, had exhausted the soil for this very crop. Now, this idea of we follow those who came before and then others will follow us, that notion of the cultural cyclical nature, and of course gardening and farming allows us to be reminded of this. He says a few lines later, I would advise you, as if you're reading this chapter to know when you're supposed to hoe your beans, I would advise you to do all your work if possible while the dew is on. I began to level the ranks of haughty weeds in my bean field and throw dust upon their heads. Early in the morning, I worked barefooted, dappling like a plastic artist in the dewy and crumbling sand. But later in the day, the sun blistered my feet. He will say that he starts at 5 and ends at noon so that he can get all the other work that needs to be done. He said, I had little aid from horses or cattle or hired men or boys or improved implements of husbandry. I was much slower and became much more, he uses this word, intimate with my beans than usual. But labor of the hands, even when pursued to the verge of drudgery, is perhaps never the worst form of idleness. He says it has a constant and imperishable moral, and to the scholar it yields a classic result. He thinks about hoeing beans the way he will talk about, for example, reading classic works in the chapter on reading. He says, when my hoe tinkled against the stones, he's always conscious of all the different types of sensual relationships. Tinkled against the stones, that music echoed to the woods and the sky and was an accompaniment to my labor which yielded an instant and immeasurable crop. It was no longer beans that I hoed, nor I that hoed beans. And I remembered with as much pity as pride, if I remembered it all, my acquaintances who had gone to the city to attend the oratorios. The night hawk circled overhead in the sunny afternoon, for I sometimes made a day of it, like a mote in the eye or in heaven's eye, falling from time to time with a swoop and a sound as if the heavens were rent, torn at last to very rags and tatters, and yet a seamless coat remained. Small imps that fill the air and lay their eggs on the ground, on bare sand or rocks on the tops of hills, where few have found them, graceful and slender, like ripples caught up from the pond, as leaves are raised by the wind to float in the heavens. Such kindredship is in nature. The hawk is aerial brother of the wave, which he sails over and surveys, those his perfect air-inflated wings answering to the elemental, unfledged pinions of the sea. I mean, you can just hear the rhythms, and it has been pointed out by scholars that when you read this language out loud, this poetry, as I call it, you do get a certain kind of rhythm that reminds you of little ripples on a pond, not unlike the power of Conrad's prose in the opening lines of Heart of Darkness. We've commented on that in another lecture. By the way, this thing about the hawk will remind us of the final lines of Whitman's Song of Myself and the Barbaric Yawp and all of that, right? Or sometimes he says, I watched a pair of hen hawks circling high in the sky, alternately soaring and descending, approaching and leaving one another as if they were the embodiment of my own thoughts. Thoughts as birds, obviously, is compelling. Or I was attracted by the passage of wild pigeons from this wood to that, with a slight quivering, winnowing sound and carrier haste. Or from under a rotten stump, my hoe turned up a sluggish, portentous, and outlandish spotted salamander, a trace of Egypt and the Nile, yet our contemporary. He loves to do this, where he'll make references to the other side of the globe and point out somehow we're all interestingly connected, beautifully connected, right? When I paused, he says, to lean on my hoe, these sounds and sights I heard and saw everywhere in the row, a part of the inexhaustible entertainment which the country offers. Beautiful, right? He continues a few lines later, I felt proud to know that the liberties of Massachusetts and of our fatherland were in such safekeeping. And I turned to my hoeing again. He's talking now about some of the cannons that have gone off. And I was filled with an inexpressible confidence and pursued my labor cheerfully with a calm trust in the future. He will speak about the weeds, and he gives a history of weeds, and then he talks about how much money he made, his 12 bushels of beans that he's so proud of. And in the end, he made $8.07 through the selling of all of his different crops. And then he says, alas, I said this to myself, but now another summer is gone, and another, and I'm obliged to say to you, reader, that the seeds which I planted, if indeed they were the seeds of those virtues, were worm-eaten or had lost their vitality, and so did not come up. Commonly, men will only be brave as their fathers were brave or timid. This generation is very sure to plant corn and beans each new year, precisely as the Indians did centuries ago and taught the first settlers to do, as if there were a fate in it. Now, this idea that men will only be as brave as their fathers were brave, I believe, has a lot to do with Thoreau's view of education. In other words, if our children today are not patriotic, it's not their fault. It's our fault for not giving them a good enough reason to be patriotic. I say as much in my opening comments when I lecture on the Declaration of Independence at learnstrong.net. You can go and be reminded of those comments. He says a few lines later, our ambassadors should be instructed to send home such seeds as these, and Congress helped to distribute them all over the land. The idea that seeds are precious. We should never stand upon ceremony with sincerity. We should never cheat and insult and banish one another by our meanness, if there were present the kernel of worth and friendliness. Now, this idea that he moves from the seed of beans to the seed of humans, powerful. We're all somehow connected, and we should respect each other as we would respect seeds. That is to say, once we've been planted, we will grow, hopefully, into good crops. We should not meet thus in haste. Most men I do not meet at all, for they seem not to have time. They're busy about their beans. And then notice he'll make this shift as he talks about how work keeps us from each other and the company of each other. He said, we should not deal with a man thus plodding ever, leaning on a hoe or a spade as a staff between his work, nor as a mushroom, but partially risen out of the earth, something more than erect, like swallows alighted and walking on the ground. And then a few lines later, ancient poetry and mythology suggest at least that husbandry was once a sacred art, but it's pursued with irreverent haste and heedlessness by us, our object being to have large farms and large crops merely. This notion that in the end it's really just about making a buck, if you will. He finishes with these lines, and I think they're brilliant. We are wont to forget that the sun looks on our cultivated fields and on the prairies and forests without distinction. They all reflect and absorb his rays alike, and the former make but a small part of the glorious picture. You'll remember Whitman calls it the glorious drama, right? Picture which he beholds in his daily course. In his view, the earth is all equally cultivated like a garden. We can't help but think of Voltaire's final lines in Candide, we must cultivate our own garden. Therefore, we should receive the benefit of this light, of his light and heat, with a corresponding trust and magnanimity. Thoreau loves this word, magnanimous, which means to be charitable, to be pious, would be Wordsworth's words at the conclusion of my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. I could wish my days to be foundations my natural piety, magnanimity. But though I value the seed of these beans and harvest that in the fall of the... What though I value the seed of these beans and harvest that in the fall of the year? This broad field which I've looked at so long looks not to me as the principal cultivator, but away from me to influences more genial to it, which water and make it green. These beans have results which are not harvested by me. Do they not grow partly for woodchucks? I mean, it's a fun way for him to say it. He says, shall I not rejoice also at the abundance of the weeds, whose seeds are the granary of the birds? It matters little comparatively whether the fields fill the farmer's barns. The true husbandman will cease from anxiety. And I would say he's really saying the true poet or the true seeker, right? The true husbandman will cease from anxiety as the squirrels manifest no concern whether the woods will bear chestnuts this year or not, and finish his labor with every day, relinquishing all claim to the produce of his fields and sacrificing in his mind not only his first, but his last fruits also. Whitman will write, of course, in Leaves of Grass, I think I could turn and live with the animals because there's no sense of worrying all the time. Here is anxiety, right? In other words, ontologically speaking, it's true, we are creatures of concern and curiosity, but we're also psychologically creatures of fear and anxiety. He says, let's not worry about what tomorrow brings. Tomorrow is going to have its own, as Christ says in the Matthew Gospel, its own concerns, its own worries. Well, this is the first of the two dualities between chapter 7 and chapter 8, where we'll visit the village. And here I hope that you'll enjoy Thoreau's tremendous poetry and the metaphor, of course, of the joy of planting seeds. Thank you.